So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for coming over here, and I hope to present before you a research work which I have been involved in ever since 1999. I just finished it last year, to be precise, 2017. So it's almost 18 years of hard work. It was like a voyage which I undertook through a lot of whirlpools, a lot of disturbing seas, and perhaps the information that you'll now become privy to might also inform you the reason of my unrest and the reason that possessed me actually, or obsessed me to pursue this uncharted course and try my best to come up with some of the answers that actually arose in my mind. So just to start off, I'd just like to say this, that back in 1999, Al-Mawrid, our institute, had started Islamic studies program at the graduate level. So I was called upon to teach the Quranic part, and when I began to teach the Quranic part, obviously it was in line to introduce the Quran first, the type of book it is, the history it has, the language it has, and then begin with the text of the Quran. So it was the first time that I actually started seriously reading about the history of the Quran. Prior to that, I just had a very superficial knowledge, and it was very understandable because the piece of news that we have from the Quran is that it was revealed by the Almighty, and ever since its revelation, it has been under God's protection. So that's the end of that. So the Quran is the word of God. The Quran was revealed by the Almighty to the Prophet 14 centuries ago, and today, after 14 centuries, every Muslim child is indoctrinated or is told from the very start of his Quranic teaching that this is the book that we have preserved entirely the way God had revealed it. And I was obviously of the same impression. But when I started teaching these classes and I started seriously studying in more depth regarding this topic, it sort of blew my mind, and I came across so many things which really disturbed me, bothered me, and dissatisfied me. And I thought that, well, I have to teach a course. It's a 6-month course. I'll try my best to go through it. But once I'm through that course, I'll embark upon my own journey to find out the answers to the question that have come to my mind. And I knew that the students who would be there, of course, might not know the whole background, because the graduate level teaching is not the ultimate level teaching. So it's not that advanced level teaching. But in order to do that teaching as well, you have to study at the advanced level. The teacher has to know much more than the student. So I passed those 6 months in complete agony, because every time that I was teaching this topic, I had new questions in my mind. I had a lot of problems and a lot of doubts that started to arise in my mind, that what kind of a history that we are teaching our students, our children of the future, and at the same time claiming that the Quran is the word of God, it is the book of God, and it has remained unaltered, it has remained unchanged precisely in the form that it was revealed. So when I started to study, I actually started off by tabulating the questions, or I would say objections or questions or reservations, call it what you can, that came to my mind. And I made a list of a whole lot of these questions. I'm going to present those questions before you so that you can have some idea. Not all the questions, because some of them are very technical and require an Arabic background. So I'm going to skip that part. But some of the important questions which an audience of any language can understand, they are the ones that I'm going to pose before you. So I've named my presentation Revisiting the History of the Quran, and here basically when I speak of the history of the Quran, I'm referring to the fact that we all know that the Quran was revealed piecemeal in installments over a period of 23 years, and later on it was recompiled in a new order, because we know the chronological sequence was different, and the Quran that we have today is entirely different. It's in a new sequence. And since it was not revealed in one installment, in one go, the question has arisen in the minds of various scholars that how do we date the fact that the Quran was given its final shape? when was the Quran given its final shape. So we have conflicting views on that, and I'll describe them as we go along. But I actually named my presentation as Revisiting the History of the Quran, because when I say revisiting, I actually mean re-evaluating, critically thinking, rethinking the history of the Quran, because the way it has been presented before our audience, before our academic audience, is something that either you shut your mind and accept it as an emotional expression that the Quran has been preserved and it is the very Quran that we have, and you don't question it. That's the only way that you can accept that history without questioning it. The only way that you can accept the history which is generally narrated regarding the Quran is that you just blindly read through it and just shut off your mind to the questions that arise to it. And that's what's been happening, unfortunately, over the past so many centuries. And we have voices, we have scholars who have raised these questions, but because the general trend has been to accept whatever history which is based on the historical narratives, like those found in his history books as well as those found in the earliest canonical collections of hadith like Bukhari, Muslim, Sunan ibn Majah, Sunan Tirmidhi, etc. So that is the reason that there came a time in our own history that people thought that whatever has been written in the name of Quran history from external sources is actually unchallengeable, and it's very valid. It's as authentic as it can be, and we just cannot challenge it. And this has remained our general mindset over so many centuries, until I would say a personality by the name of Hamiduddin Farahi. Some of you might have heard of him. So he was the teacher of my teacher's teacher. So Ghamidi Sahib's, who's my teacher, his teacher is Amin Hasan Islahi. Most of you would know him by name because he's written a tafsir, a commentary on the Quran by the name of the Tadabbur-e-Quran. It's available. And his teacher was actually Hamiduddin Farahi. Now Farahi is an Indian-born person. He was born in Azamgarh. He was born in the year 1863 and he passed away in 1930. So his span of life is the turning point, I would say, in the re-evaluation of the history of the Quran. So whatever I'm presenting, I owe a lot to him, the way he actually viewed his whole thesis. But the fact is that most of his works are in Arabic, and since people generally are not aware of Arabic, so his works have been pushed into oblivion. And of course, the ulama or the scholars who know Arabic, they are very few and far between. They do know his works, but generally he's not very well introduced. He is more introduced through his student and the student of his student. So I owe a lot to his research, and I have basically presented his research as a counter narrative to the traditional narrative. So when I say revisiting the history of the history of the Quran would mean the general narrative on the history of the Quran, and revisiting would mean a counter narrative or the alternative picture regarding the history of the Quran. So that's just to put you in background. So let me start off, if you could move the slide please, that the questions that I had in mind, as I said before you, which actually asked me or inspired me or pushed me into finding out what the truth is, were, as I said, they were numerous, but today before you I'm going to enumerate 10 of them which actually gave me sleepless nights for quite a while, and they were the ones which actually pushed me or induced me to find out what the truth behind them is. So the first question that I'm presenting before you is a question that perhaps some of you would come to know for the first time today, and that is that we today have 5 different versions of the Quran prevailing in the Muslim Ummah. When I say 5 different versions, it means actually 5 different Qurans. One of them is the one that we know, that you might be reading when you were growing up, or when you were being taught in your schools, or when the Qari Sahib was teaching you. So that is one version, and I would say that is the dominant version as well. So a very one time I did calculate percentages vis-a-vis the people who read this dominant version, and I had this figure of 97% or close to 98% people reading the same version or same Quran that we are used to, that in the subcontinent or people here in the UK or the US, other parts of the world are generally used to. But there was this 2% or 2.5%, which actually accounted for about 11 countries. 11 countries having different Qurans. So one of the Qurans is the one that we know, and there are then 4 different Qurans which are distributed in those 4 countries. And most of those countries are northwestern and northeastern Arab countries, like for example Egypt, Sudan, Mauritania, Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Senegal, Gambia, and one Arab country, and that is Yemen. Now that poses a huge question, because Yemen was the only territory which was actually conquered in the time of the Prophet. You know that Ali radhiyallahu anhu and Muaz bin Jabal were sent there as their respective governors. So a place like Yemen, which is part of the Arabian Peninsula, very much part of the Arabian Peninsula, having a different version of the Quran does give you a lot of, I would say, mind-boggling scenarios, because we can think of areas which are far off to have some discrepancy. But why did this discrepancy arise in an area, in a territory which was conquered in the times of the Prophet, in where the Sahaba actually went not later as they did in the case of African countries, but right in the time when the Prophet himself was alive? So one of the versions, as I said, is the version that could you please, so this is the version that we are used to. It is called the Riwayah, the spelling mistake here, it's called the Riwayah of Hafs from the Qira'at of Asim. Just make a note of this, just forget about the names, because these are going to be explained later on. So each version of the Quran is actually attributed to a famous reciter of the Quran, or a famous Qari of the Quran. So one of the famous or very famous Qari, his name is Asim ibn Najud. He died in 127 Hijrah, and his Quran originated, it is said, from Kufa, and this is where he was born and he lived his life. And this Quran is the one which, as I said, is the dominant Quran, is the 98% or 97.5% Quran that we are aware of. And of course, when you ask me what are the internal differences, I'm going to give you examples later on. But just to first put you in perspective, that you need to understand that these 5 versions prevail, and as I said, one of them is the very dominant one, and the next 4, they are found in 2% of the Muslim population, comprising 11 or 12 countries. So the name, as I said, each of these 5 versions is named after a Qari. Of course, that is even more surprising, that one would not expect a Quranic version to be named after some reciter, because we know that the Quran was given to us by God through Gabriel, through the Prophet Muhammad. So one would expect that this is the version of Muhammad, or this is the version of what God actually transferred to Muhammad. But lo and behold, it's not like that, and we have these 5 versions, even the dominant version not being named after the Prophet, but being named after a very famous Qari. So could you please move ahead? So we now have another version, which is the second version, and this one is the one prevalent in Morocco and Algeria, and it is called the Riwayah of Warsh from the Qira'ah of Nafi. Now, the Riwayah of Warsh means that Warsh himself was an Egyptian. He was a student of Nafi, and Nafi was a famous reciter who belonged to the city of Medina, and his Quran is today famous in Morocco and Algeria. So physically, if you go there, because I went to Morocco a long time ago to study regarding my research, and I had debates with the shuyukh of Morocco. And by the way, if you might be knowing the fact that the oldest Islamic university today is in Prevailing, which is in Morocco, and it was actually made in 889 AD. 889. So no Oxford, no Cambridge, no Al-Azhar, no. So the oldest ever university is this Muslim university. It's called the University of Prevailing, and it is located in Fez, which is called Fas in Arabic, and that is a place which is very near Rabat, which is the capital of Morocco. So we have a version of the Quran which is ascribed to a famous Qari, a famous reciter, and his name is Nafi ibn Abi Nu'aym to be exact. So I have also given you the exact period of that person, the famous reciter. He died in 169 Hijrah. So as you know that these are the Hijri dates. And then we have a third version, and so this is the version of Qalun from the Qiraat of Nafi. Remember, we had Nafi in the previous one as well. The difference here is that the student of Nafi changes. Previously, although the source was Nafi and his student was Qalun, previously we had Nafi and his student was Warsh. So you can see that even from his citer, his two students branched off and they had different versions. So that's a third version, and that he himself, as I said, already said that he belonged to Medina. But today, if you go to Libya and if you go to Tunisia, you'll find that his Quran is being read the way we read our Quran in our areas. And I'm still deferring the question regarding what exactly are the differences between these versions. So that's going to come later. But for the moment, we have to understand that the extent of this, if I may call it disruption, is that as early as the 2nd century, we have this phenomena in which the Quran was being read differently by a famous reciter of the Quran who belonged to Medina, and Medina we know is a place where the Prophet lived for about 12 years. So Libya and Tunisia today are the places where you'll find them. And next we have the riwayah of Ad-Duri from the Qira'ah of Abu Amr. So the first person is always a student, and the person which succeeds that name is always the teacher. But the Quran itself, the riwayah with which it becomes famous, is from the student of that teacher. So basically it's the Quran of Duri. This person lived around this era. He died in this era, in this year. He lived in Basra, which is of course the city of Iraq, present day Iraq. And it is claimed that this is actually found in parts of Sudan. So all of you must be knowing Sudan. And so,
sorry, just a quick one. So on this one, it's parts of Sudan. With the earlier ones, we had
the whole country. So that is, so we are referring to the fact that at times a country in its national capacity, in its controlled national capacity, in which the government itself behind those publishing, I would say, institutes, publishes them and then distributes them to the whole empire or the whole territory. But here we have Sudan, in which parts of them ascribe to this Qiraat and other parts who ascribe to the same Qiraat as we ascribe to the Qiraat of Hafs from Asim. So that is why it's called parts of Sudan, because Sudan has more than one. So some other parts have another Qiraat and some other parts have this Qiraat. So this is the fourth one. And now we have the fifth version. This is the riwayah of Hisham from the Qira'ah of Ibn Amir. So as I said, this is the teacher, this is his student. He died in this year, the teacher, and he belonged to Damascus. He was one of the very earliest one. If you note, he's the earliest Qari. The rest of them died later after this date. He is the person who died almost contemporaneous to the passing away of the last Sahabi. We know that the last Sahabi who passed away was in 93 Hijrah, Anas ibn Malik. He was the person who was actually one of the attendants of the Prophet also. So he passed away in 93 or 94 Hijrah. So very close to that time. He's like being a contemporary to a companion of the Prophet. So he had his own version of the Quran, and this is being read today in parts of Yemen. Again, when we say parts, it actually means Hazarmaut. So Hazarmaut is a city in Yemen where we have this different Quran, but the rest of the Yemen still has the Hafs version. So these are the five, I would say, versions that today exist. They have been verified to exist. We know that they are found, and the biggest thing that has happened in the last, I would say, last decade is that the Mujamma al-Fahd, which is the foremost printing institute in the Muslim Ummah in Saudi Arabia, has started to publish all these Qurans. So these five versions, you can say, are being published by the Vatican of the Muslim Ummah, which is of course Mecca and Medina. So if you remember King Fahd, who passed away almost a decade ago, so he was the person who actually formed this huge complex which would publish these Qurans, and that is why that complex is actually named after him. It's called the Mujamma al-Fahd. Mujamma in Arabic means institute or a setup or an organization. So it was named after him because he took the initiative and he said that since we have Hajis coming from all over the world, so we just cannot impose our Quran on them. So we have to print the Qurans that they read in their territories. So that is why they started to print the Qurans. And now if you are a Moroccan Haji, you come there for Hajj, you are gifted that green Quran or the blue Quran that all of us get when we go for Umrah or Hajj. it's different from inside, it's the same from outside. So a Moroccan Haji will get the Quran that he is used to. An Algerian Haji will get the Quran that he is used to. A Pakistani one would get the one that he is used to. The bottom line is that the controlling center, which is of course Medina or Makkah, they have endorsed these Qurans by actually publishing them, and not only publishing them but giving them to the Hajis, and other than that distributing them in the whole kingdom, so as to endorse the fact that these are the 5 versions. And as I go along with my presentation, I'll tell you that this is just one major issue. Otherwise, the classical issue is that there are more than 5 versions, but those other versions are not found physically being read in certain territories, but they are found in our tafsir books, they are found in our history books, they are found in our fiqh books, they are found in our seerah books, they are found in almost everywhere, and foremost in the hadith books. So those other versions also exist. These 5 versions exist physically. They are printed. Our children read them. They discuss them. There are tafsirs on those versions. It's like a living tradition that they follow. But there are other versions besides these 5 versions, and they are more than about, I would say, numerous. There are more than 36, I would say.
Is the message the same?
The what?
The message coming from
the message is pretty much the same, but there are at times when the translation of a particular verse changes. And for if you want an example, there is an example in which for the wuzu, the way you do your wuzu changes. And for example, in one of the narrations, you don't need to wash your feet. You just need to wipe it, like do masa. As far as your feet are concerned, you need, that would do it. Because the way that verse is mentioned in that particular version does not say that feet need to be washed. Another example is the change in shares of inheritance, which of course changes the amount that is allocated to the various heirs, and there are other examples as well. But here we are more concerned of the fact that since we have given this primary thesis that the Quran has not changed the slightest, the smallest bit. So even if the message has not changed, it's a parallel message, it's the same message expressed in synonymous words. There does arise this question that then how come we can say or claim the fact that there is a single Quran?
Does Allah say in the Quran that this will not be changed until the day of doom?
That's what He says. Inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun, which means that we have revealed this Quran and we are its protectors. We are the ones who are going to safeguard it. So, and that is what every Muslim child is indoctrinated with. The time, as soon as he reads the Quran through a qari, this is that background knowledge which is transferred from all parts of his relatives, everyone, his books, his teachers, let's say, and this becomes a given. It's by default that you think that this is the Quran.
Is that not contradictory then to that verse?
Of course, that this data is apparently contradictory. Apparently,
yeah.
Because when either you deny the data, which we cannot.
No.
And if the data is there, then there has to be some explanation that why did God say that we have protected the Quran when seemingly we don't see this protection as far as empirical evidence is concerned. So if you could move this. So now I'm going to give an example of how there is a difference between the versions of the Quran. So these are some examples that I've sifted out for you, picked for you, so that you can have an idea as to what difference exactly is there amongst these various 5 versions that I just outlined. So one, for example, difference is I have actually given it a name. It's called change/deletion of words. Now the Quran that we read is this one. It says فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. But the Quran, which is one of the other Qurans, has a different verse with the huwa suppressed, deleted, as I said in the title. So the words there are فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. The huwa is missing. So the Moroccan Quranic reader would not read this verse like this, but he would rather read it like this, which of course is a deviation. And if you ask me what the difference is, the difference here is on emphasis. This is a pronoun which actually emphasizes the fact. The translation would read, indeed God is self-sufficient and praiseworthy. This is the simple translation. But the addition of huwa would mean, indeed it is God only who is self-sufficient and praiseworthy. And other than that, the meaning would be a simple statement that God is self-sufficient and praiseworthy. So the huwa actually adds emphasis or stress to the attributes of God, which I mentioned later on. Then there is another difference. in a type of difference. I'm trying to enumerate differences which actually I can communicate to you even if you don't know Arabic, because there are other differences which at the moment I'm not touching upon because they are slightly more technical. So the second difference that you can see here is a difference in singular and plural. Now observe this word here, kitab. So this is the 12th verse of Surah Tahrim, which is the 66th surah of the Quran. The Quran that we have reads like this: وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا وَكُتُبِهِ وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ. However, one of the other Qurans has a difference. The word kutub is a plural of the word kitab. You know what a singular and a plural is. So in the other version we have وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا وَكِتَابِهِ وَكِتَابِهِ وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ. Actually, this is a verse which relates to Virgin Mary, and it says that she was the one who actually attested to the words of God and His books, and she was amongst the obedient. This is what the verse means. But here it means she attested to all the books of God, because it's kutub, it's in the plural. On the other hand, a different version has kitab, which would refer to the fact that she is actually referring to one book, not actually specifying which the book is, which exactly the book is, but the fact is that she's referring to a single book instead of many books, which the previous version has. So we have now another, you can change it, a third category of differences, and which is summed up as the difference in verbs. So you can see the first part reading as وَإِذْ أَنْجَيْنَاكُمْ مِنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ يُسُومُونَكُمْ سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ يُقَتِّلُونَ أَبْنَاءَكُمْ. This is one version, and then we have another version in which the word yuqattilun is actually yaqtulun, which all people who know Arabic changes the meaning. Qattala means to kill someone in an exemplary manner, in a very harsh way, in a way in which you can make an example of that killing, of that execution, because he's done something wrong. For example, maybe he's raped some small girl, so we have been asked to punish a person who has this extreme committed this extreme crime in this way. But other than that, a normal verse would read yaqtuluna abnaakum, which means to kill their children. This particular verse actually occurs in the context of Moses and the Pharaoh. You know, the Pharaoh had ordered the killing of all the children, a male child. So this is basically telling us that remember God's favor on you. Have a glass of water or something. So this actually tells us that we are being told, remember that how God actually saved us from the Pharaoh and his people, who would inflict severe punishment on them. How? By actually killing their male child. So this is what the verse means. But one would mean killing the male child in a very harsh way, and the other would mean a normal killing, just executing him. And then we have a fourth form of variation, I would say, or difference, which says that basically the i'rab or the declensions are the ones which change. Thank you. So as you can see, this is Surah Al-Lahab. Here it says excuse me, it says Hammalat al-Hatab, and here it says Hammalatul Hatab. So we have a zabar. It's technically called an accusative, and this is the nominative case in which we have a rafa. So it says Hammalatul Hatab, and in both cases, as I said, this is one of the areas in which you need to know Arabic to have a full grasp of the change in meaning. But I can tell you that meanings change simply by changing the nominative case into the accusative case, by changing the pesh into the zabar, so to speak. So these are the four broad, I would say. There are other areas as well in which there is a difference of verses, a difference of words, but these are the broad areas which I myself have tried to identify. And if you look at the Quran, for example, a typical Quran is about 500 pages, 450 pages, average Quran, whether smaller, large in size. So typically you'll find that these variations, there are about 7 or 8 on each page, easily. So if there are 7 or 8 variations on each page, and we have about 500 pages, so that would amount to 3,500 or what? So we have about 3,500 differences between these 5 Qurans themselves. That's a rough estimate. Of course, this could be about plus or minus 10-15%. But just to give you a rough idea that this difference which I have just enumerated in some of the verses, it practically exists in one. If you have one page of the Quran, a single page of the Quran generally has about 10 verses or 12 verses depending upon the size. But 12 to 14 verses, you will have typically 7 or 8 of them internally differing from one another. So that's how I would say or suggest to you. And now this is the first question. So I've just answered excuse me, the first question that actually came to my mind and which bothered me. I have just about tried to summarize it before you. There are 9 more questions, but this was the first question, that we, in our capacity as an ummah, have this variation in the Quran. We have 5 versions of the Quran physically, practically found in the whole ummah. We've got about 155 Muslim countries, about 156 of them, and out of them 145 read one version, and the 11 of them have these 4 other versions. So and the nature of these differences are some of them are some of these which I have just described before you. Other than that, there have been other differences as well. So this was the first and the most, I would say, gravest question that really shook me. Now let's move on to the second question. Excuse me. Okay, so as I introduced earlier on, I said that as far as those variant Qurans are concerned, they are primarily found physically in certain territories. Now comes a second category of variation, and that is the existence of these variant readings, as we have come to call them, not physically, like in physical places, but in our books of tafsir. So if you pick up, excuse me, I seem to have swallowed something which is bothering my lining. So you will find these tafsir works. Just pick up any classical tafsir. For example, you pick up Tabari, you pick up Ibn Kasir, you pick up Razi, you pick up Zamakhshari. These are all classical exegesis of the Quran belonging to the early part of the Muslim academia. So you'll find that various, although you're not being able to see this verse in focus, but maybe you can have this presentation, when you can have it emailed, and you can just zoom it, and then you'll be able to find that there is this center Quran, which is the Quran that we all read, the Quran of Hafs. And then this is an area in which how these verses actually differed have been mentioned here. So it is slightly difficult for you, of course, to see, but I can, from my own point, see how each verse is mentioned in the margin, almost every verse, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of them actually. So 11 differences in reading certain verses are enumerated on these columns beside the main reading, just to give you an idea that how these verses can also be read. Different versions of the same verse. And what is the difference? The same. At times singular and plural, at times the i'rab, at times the fact that they have verb patterns which are different. So you can find almost each and every page which endorses the fact. So the difference that you need to make here is that the first question that was asked, or that was basically discussed, was a question which related to the existence, to the physical existence of these readings in territories they were being read. The second question actually relates to the fact that these are not physically read in territories, but every scholar of the Quran who reads the Quran in Arabic knows that these verses can be read differently as well. So it's like saying that the first related to physical presence of those verses which were variant, people were actually reading them, and the second one is the one in which, although people might not be reading them in their territories, in their areas, but all tafsir books, now you know what a tafsir is. It's a book which relates to the explanation of the Quranic verses. So no better, no closer a book to the Quran than tafsir, because what the Quran says, a tafsir is meant to explain that. So the closest book on the Quran, after the Quran, has to be a tafsir work which explains what the Quran is. So All these readings have been sifted out basically from those particular tafsir books. Could we move ahead? Okay, now let me come to the third question. So just to sum up, the first two questions related to the variations found in the Quran. Now the third question actually relates to the fact that there are historical narratives, there are narratives in hadith literature which seem to tell us, apparently tell us, that the Quran that we have today is incomplete. It's totally different from the Quran that perhaps was at the time of the Prophet, because there are certain hadith verses or hadiths which tell us that there are certain verses in the Quran which are missing, and the hadith says that this is the verse which was found originally in the Quran, but it no longer is there. So I'm going to give you two examples. Examples abound. I can quote a number of examples, in excess of 50 maybe, but I'm just going to give you two examples because they are very prominent, and most of people who have some background knowledge of the Quran, they already are aware of these examples. So one of them is the stoning verse. And the stoning verse, of course, is the verse in which we know, which our scholars claim that it existed in the Quran. It is no longer in the Quran, but it is still operative as the Quran. Listen again. It's no longer in the Quran. It lies outside the Quran, but it has the same authority as the Quran, because it's, although not part of the Quran, it's like saying that if, for example, this is the Quran, or this is the Quran. If this is the Quran, all that the Quran is found here. There are a couple of verses which are not here. There's somehow they found their way outside the Quran. They're lying outside the Quran, not in the main Quran. They're lying in history, they're lying in hadith narratives. So they claim that these verses were actually taken out of the Quran somehow, but in spite of being taken out, they are still operative and have the same status as the Quran.
So in this case, you are saying that these are verses that have, as Quran says, have not been replaced by better verses.
They are not being replaced. They are the ones which have been, they are original verses. There was no abrogation, and they have just been spaced out for various reasons. And I'm going to explain some of the reasons. But
sorry, one thing. When you say the incompleteness was found through the hadith,
right,
but it can't be hadith. It should be riwayat of the Sahabas.
but they attribute it to the Sahaba, and I'm talking about hadith in the broad sense, because at times the asar of Sahaba are also termed as hadith. So when I say hadith, I'm not exactly saying attributing to the saying of the Prophet, although we have those as well. We do have the Prophet's sayings which tell us that there were certain other verses of the Quran which are no longer, because a Sahabi typically ascribes his view to the Prophet. It's not that he's going to say something independently. So although they are present also, but since they are present in works of history and hadith, which are secondary works, so I have not cited them. I have confined myself to primary works. So this stoning verse actually of the Quran tells us that the perpetrators of adultery, when you, of course, consensual marriage between unrelated or unmarried people takes place, so they have to be stoned to death. So the verse, it says, I'm going to read the verse actually. Could you change it and you'll just have a idea. This is now that actual hadith which is found in the Sunan of Ibn Majah. I'm not going to read the Arabic, just a translation, and see what it says. First of all, please note it is from no other than a very authoritative personality of Umar ibn Khattab. We know the kind of person he is and he was. So it is said, Umar ibn Khattab said, now mark these words, he's saying, I fear. If Umar fears something, then this is something which really has to be feared, because he was a fearless person. We know that. So he says, I fear that time will pass over people until someone will say, I do not find the verse of stoning in the book of God. He's saying this on a sermon that he's delivering on a pulpit, that people will say that I do not find the stoning verse of stoning in the book of God. So in this way, people will be led astray by abandoning a directive from among the directives of God. Bear in mind that stoning is the rightful punishment for a married person who has committed adultery, and it is established through evidence or pregnancy or confession. And I have read, now he's reading that verse which supposedly was part of the Quran. However, it no longer is part of the Quran. And this is the stoning verse. It says, "Ash-shaykhu wash-shaykhatu iza zanaya farjumuhuma al-battata." And it translates, and I've actually translated it the way people generally translate it, because we have our own critique on this verse, but generally it has been translated as stone to death necessarily the married man and the married woman guilty of adultery. And then he says, God's messenger stoned criminals for this crime, and so did we after them. So this is one example of the fact that a person of the stature of Umar ibn al-Khattab, those of you who know him how his disposition, his fearless character, he is actually expressing his fear that time will pass and people will forget this verse. And there's another version of this narrative which says that had I not feared that people would say that Umar had added to the book of God, I would have placed that verse in the text of the Quran. So another version of the same narrative says that had it not been the fact that people are going to say that Umar is adding some new verse to the Quran, I fear that that is keeping me away from adding to the Quran. Otherwise, the fact of the matter is that verse is part of the Quran. But I fear people would condemn me that Umar is adding something to the Quran. That is why I'm not going to add it. I'm just going to point it out.
Is it not
Sorry,
contradictory?
so you're saying that during the time of Umar it was already omitted, or it was going to
That's
be
what he claimed. I am not saying anything. What I'm saying is this is what this hadith claims. This narrative of the Prophet says that in his times, Umar said that there is one verse of the Quran. Of course, when he was saying this, the Prophet had passed away about 4 or 5 years ago. So his own tenure was about 10 years. Umar ruled for about 10 years. So we don't know which part of his era was the sermon. But approximately, let's say 3 or 4 years. So what he's saying is that in his own times, in his own era, the time that he is now delivering the sermon, I do not find this verse in the Quran which used to be there in the times of the Prophet. And had it not been the case that people would condemn Umar that I am adding something to the Quran, I would definitely have written it in the text of the Quran. And then he says, okay, what best I can do is I can just point it out to you, and the verse is this. I'm not going to write it there, but I'm going to let you know that it was part of the Quran, but I don't have the courage to add it back to the Quran, because if I do it, people today who are living today will say that Umar is corrupting the Quran or adding something to the Quran. And so this is the verse which is Ash-shaykhu wash-shaykhu iza zanaya. So one of the reasons for punishing perpetrators of adultery who are married is this verse. So in technical terms, it is called Mansukhu Tilawa Dunul Hukm. Mansukhu Tilawa means some verse whose recital has been revoked. Mansukh is revokal, abrogation. Tilawa means recital. Dunul Hukm, except the Hukm. The tilawat has been revoked, but hukam has not been revoked. Hukam means its application. It's still there for us. So today, if you consult any book of fiqh, just pick up any book from any sect or any faqih of any jurist, you'll find out that amongst other reasoning, one of the reasoning that they'll put forward for the stoning of adulterous people is this verse, and they would say that it is still operational, although it is not found in the Quran.
How come it was taken out from the Quran?
So that's the question that naturally arises. So they don't answer this question. They say that somehow it was taken out because Umar has reported the fact, so he must not be lying.
They have found out from the hadith.
Of course,
Yeah.
that's it.
That's what happened.
So this hadith, this is what Umar is reporting. Remember, this hadith was compiled years after Umar himself. So Umar died much earlier. Imam Bukhari or Imam Ibn Majah, from where this narrative is taken, he died in around 356 Hijrah. 310 Hijrah, around that. So there's a whole gap of about 250 years in which this is being reported by a hadith collector. Otherwise, other than that, we have this chain of narration which says that a person like Umar ibn al-Khattab, who actually said to Abdullah and Ibn Abbas, Abdullah is of course another narrator who lies between Ubaidullah ibn Abdullah, and then we have Ibn Abbas. So this is the chain of narration which tells us in the first 100 years or 150 years of this compilation, this narrative was already in circulation somehow, and it got to Ibn Majah when he compiled it. So we can discuss the details of that, but first please concentrate on the fact that a very big authority of hadith is saying that this is how I have come across knowledge or data that there is verse of the Quran found outside the Quran. So therefore, although it's not the Quran, but it is still the Quran. It virtually amounts to saying it's not the Quran, but it is the Quran. As वो उर्दू में एक बड़ा मशहूर शेर है ना कि हर चंद कहीं के है पर नहीं है. So it is a famous Urdu couplet.
So at the moment you are saying that obviously this is the basis of.
This is the basis of history.
We're not saying that whether this hadith is correct.
We are not talking about that. That is going to come when we later on analyze these questions. So don't think that I'm presenting my view or I'm trying to say this is the correct. What I'm saying is this is how traditionally the history of the Quran is presented.
Well, as we've seen, God's words itself haven't come to humans in pristine condition. There's little changes you've shown us. So how can we follow a hadith which is a man?
So that's the question that can arise in the mind of any sane person. But as I said, our tradition follows what has been written already, and they don't question it, they don't challenge it. So this is one of the questions, or one of the areas in which we actually need to use our intellect and try to come to what the truth is.
Now that if we see these two hadiths, it means because he was a ruler of his own time. So actually saying that it was all done at the time of Abu Bakr.
Or in the time of the Prophet, or maybe when he died right after, or because the Quran was completed well in his times in the Arza al-Akhira, which was the last Hajj, it was somehow taken out, and he is actually implying the fact that even though I am the Caliph of the Muslims, and we know he was one of the most powerful caliphs amongst all the four, perhaps he was the most powerful and the most courageous of people amongst the Sahaba, and he is saying something. What the picture emerges is that Umar knows that there is something which is part of the Quran, and he is showing some complacency. He's not at all concerned that even if people are going to condemn him, we would expect him to do the same, because a person of the stature of Umar, he should not be fearing condemnation of people. That's what common sense says, because he should be more concerned with what the Quran actually is. So he should be saying that even though people are going to condemn me, I'm still going to tell them this is part of the Quran. This is the Umar that we know. The Umar that we know would have said this. Other than that, we find him in a very meek, apologetic, timid tone, telling people that, okay, this is the Quran, but I don't have the guts to place it in the Quran. That is in simple words.
Reported by any other Sahaba?
No, it's reported by several. This particular verse is reported by Umar and some of the other people, because I am not going into the details of some of the other people who have reported, but he's not the only person.
Okay.
I have actually named him because he's the most prominent authority.
But it has been reported
by other Sahaba as well. So he's the most prominent person who was reported.
Would it maybe be more accurate to just say allegedly reported?
Allegedly reported, of course. When I say reported, I mean people who present this as a basis of the deduction. So, right.
So what's about the sources of Quran? That is, we heard that there are two sources of Quran to collection. One is the collection, the other one is the hifz. So, what source we are believing on? Either the
No,
Quran
you
is
see, what I'm trying to say here is that these are the questions which arise because of the traditional account which is presented to us. Your question relates to a critique of this view. That's what we're going to discuss later on. At the moment, we are just trying to see that this is how our children are taught what the Quran's history is. This is how I actually came to know what the history of the Quran is, and this is being told for centuries in the past. It's being done like that. Even today, if you go to any book which says a book on Quranic sciences, it will typically narrate to you this story which I am just telling you. So what we are saying is,
you go to Saudi Arabia and tell them they've got 5
even there,
arrested,
you'll
be put in jail.
You'll not be put in jail because they acknowledge these 5 versions. As I said, they published them.
They're printing it.
They are printing them
So
in large numbers.
Why is it not? Because one thing I'll say, I felt when going to school in this country, speaking to Christians, something special about me telling my friend that no, our book is the same. There's not a dot.
Right.
difference.
That is because the general layman Christian is not acquainted with these issues. They are academicians, they are researchers, they are very well aware, because I am in touch with them, and they have this very genuine question when they say that, okay, what about the Quran? Which version are you talking about? And if you're talking about the 5 versions, okay, we can maybe sit and talk about one of the versions. But we have many other verses, which I just said on point number 2, that besides those 5 physically existing versions, they are tacitly existing in those tafsir books in almost every book of Quranic exegesis. So that is where we have no answer to tell them, because the history that we tell them is this.
So do we have this when we talk about variations between the 5 different different Qurans? Do we have commonality between the variations as well, between, let's say, 2 or 3?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. There are some variations which are common to some of the versions. There are some which are distinct to a single version, not found, but there are examples in which we have.
You said there is one version which is more dominant than others. So
Right.
what's the reason that it became dominant?
So as I said, that is the question that we're going to take up later on. So at the moment, I am just trying to enumerate the problems so that you can understand the nature of work that I had to go through, or the nature of, or the extent of time I had to put into, because of the fact that these are not issues raised today. These are age-old issues ever since the time of Imam Bukhari maybe. So these are about 12 centuries old. So you need to first understand that this is how history of the Quran is being taught, not only to our youngsters, but people like the Western scholars who study the Quran for themselves in their history. They are also given the same version, and that is why they come up with these counter questions. That is why they have this question with them that they would like to find out. And therefore, I would say that this is something of huge importance to us. So would you like to take a break here?
Yeah, please.
And we take the namaz.